Okay, good morning. So today, we are going to finish this chapter on fiscal policy. Let me start with a quick review of what we have learned. So the reason why we may want a government intervention and the reason why we may want to study fiscal policy largely start from this equation. So this equation tells us the government has the ability directly or indirectly affect our aggregate demand. But then, so remember from previous chapter, when we talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we knew, so if we can somehow affect aggregate demand, then so we have the ability to affect the equilibrium GDP and the aggregate price. This is particularly relevant when the economy is hit by a demand shock, right? Just think about if the economy hit by a negative demand shock, if the government has the ability directly or indirectly affect aggregate demand, and then so we can restore our economy back to the normal without waiting for the economy to adjust itself, which may imply a lengthy and painful recession process. Okay, so that's where we start. Now, so we have studied fiscal policy. So essentially, fiscal policy is use of taxes, government transfer, or government purchase of goods and service to shift the aggregate demand curve, or in other words, to affect aggregate demand, right? And we have looked at two types of fiscal policy, expansionary versus contractionary. So the difference is expansionary fiscal policy is going to stimulate our economy. It's like we put extra fuels for the economy so that the economy is going to become stronger. On the other hand, contractionary fiscal policy is to depress the economy, okay, to slow down the economy. You may be wondering why we may want to slow down the economy. It could be the case the economy has been overheated. It's just like your car, right? So if you're already around 80 miles per hour on highway, you may want to slow down to avoid some dangerous accidents, car accidents, right? This is kind of similar for our economy. Okay, so this is expansionary versus contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, like here, so how a fiscal policy can affect our economy. Currently, we are in a recessionary gap. Okay, how we tell? Y1 is what the economy actually produce, and YP is what the economy can potentially produce. So from this diagram, we knew Y1, which is what we actually produce, is below YP, which is what we potentially can produce. So we are in a recession. And furthermore, based on previous chapter, so we knew, so we are going to focus on demand shock. So this just implies, so we just hit by a negative demand shock, right? So now if we have the ability to run some fiscal policy, or if we let the government to intervene, what we're going to see is, so the government can lift up aggregate demand curve. How? So there are a couple of ways. First, the government can start or can initiate some purchase of goods and service. Think about the government renovate highway system. Think about the government purchase some vaccines. Okay? And the second, the government can reduce tax so that the households has more disposable income, right? Like tax cut. The third, the government can increase transfer, like what we experienced. Right? So the government sent us a check. Okay, so either of those is going to lift up aggregate demand. So now we are going to move from E1 to E2. Okay, and then so you can see, so we restore our potential GDP. You may want to remind yourself, if we lead the economy alone or we don't allow the government to intervene, what would happen? Yes, the economy eventually is going to adjust back to potential, but then the process is quite different. And throughout this adjustment process, so we are going to pay a huge cost to our society, right? Okay. Now, On the other hand, so we have contractionary fiscal policy, right? So this is represented by this diagram, right? So now right now, so we are in Y1, and in Y1, we produce more than we can potentially produce. Again, so given we look at demand shock, so this implies we have been hit by a positive demand shock, okay? And furthermore, so I want to emphasize, so now we are going to have a higher price. We are in an inflationary gap, okay? Now, what the government can do, the government is trying to cool down the economy, okay, by either increase tax rate, okay, so that households has less taxable income, disposable income, or reduce transfer, right? And furthermore, the government can reduce government purchase of goods and services, right? So in either of the case, so you're going to see the aggregate demand will be depressed, and now so we are going to adjust back to E2, so in which the government, the economy is going to produce what we can potentially produce. Again, so this is to avoid the lengthy and the painful adjustment process if we leave the economy alone. Okay, you may want to remind yourself how the economy is going to respond to this positive demand shock, or how the economy is going to respond by adjusting itself back to YP. Right, so we have talked about that earlier. So you may want to look at your previous slides. Okay. Now, what else have we have learned? So we also learned there are several critiques regarding to government's fiscal policy, and particularly expansionary fiscal policy. So there are three critiques. Government spending always crowd out private spending, right? So this is true if the aggregate demand is already strong, right? But actually, so if the aggregate demand is weak, and then so this is not true. Okay, so there's a question from the students. Is it fair to assume that when the economy is in the inflationary gap, there would probably be few government transfer? Okay. So actually, so what is fair to say is, so if we are in the inflationary gap, so we want government reduce transfer, right? So the reason why we want government reduce transfer is to avoid further inflation, right? Okay, now back to the slides. Okay, so the second critique says the government borrow always crowd out private investment spending. Again, so this is not always true. So just imagine if the government borrow, so help the economy, so we are going to make the size of our economy bigger, hence there are more we can borrow, both public and private sector. Now the third critic says government budget deficit reduce private spending. Okay, so this is related to actually this is called Ricardian equivalence. Okay, so this is not always true, depending on how the government is going to borrow, right? If the government borrow and repay in a century, okay, so that is not going to have any impact on the current generation, okay, because when the government start to repay their debt by raising tax, the current generation is already out of the economy, right? So the Ricardian equivalent just says if the government borrow and give you some transfer to stimulate the economy, okay? But then, so there's a cost. In the sense, eventually the government must raise tax to pay off the debt, right? So for from the standpoint of view of the households, they knew so today, so the government will give me transfer, but eventually the government will raise tax or tax me more so that the government can pay off the debt. Okay, so in the net term, so it seems like it's the same for me. So that's why the government budget deficit will reduce private spending. But however, as I just argued, or as I just explained to you, if the government will pay off the debt in very far future, and then so that's going to have a negative impact. Sorry, there's going to have a net impact on your current spending. So that won't reduce private spending for today. Okay. Right. So all the details are in this following 3 slides. Right. And we also mentioned fiscal policy can have significant lag. So in that sense, we may need to be very careful about fiscal policy. Okay. So the reason why there lag is because it takes time to do the following three things. First, it takes time to realize whether we are in terms of state of the economy. Secondly, so we need time to develop a plan. And finally, even though the plan has been passed by Congress, okay, and we have resource, but still, so it takes time for those actual plan to take some effects, right? So that's fiscal policy. Now, what else we have learned? Let's see. Yeah, we have seen this graph, seen this one. Right, so yeah, okay, so the last thing to look at is multiplier. Right. So let's just look at these examples. What is the multiplier? So the multiplier says if the government decide stimulate the economy by spending some extra money. Okay, so this extra spending will have a chain effect on our economy. So this is the multiplier. But here, depending on how the government spend the money, the net impact on our aggregate expenditure will be different. We look at two possibilities. In the first case, the government give us money, let the households to decide how to spend the money. On the other hand, the government initiate an increase in purchase of goods and service. Okay, and so you can see from this table and from the discussion we had in last class, you're going to see, so if the government initiate the purchase of goods and service, it's going to have larger impact compared with the government give households an additional transfer, right? The main difference is, so when the government starts the goods, the purchase of goods and service, so you can see immediately they have 50 billion. On the other hand, if the government give households 50 billion, so the households will spend a fraction and save the rest. So you can see the immediate, so the initial round effect is different. And always toward the end, the total effect is different. Right, so this is multiplier. Right. Okay, so let me summarize here, right? So the size of the shift of aggregate demand curve depends on the type of fiscal policy, right? Change in government purchase have a more powerful effect on the economy than equal size change in taxes or transfer, right? But there are a few notes. In reality, it's more complicated because in the analysis, we use lump sum taxes. But in reality, so usually we don't use lump sum tax, or lump sum tax is not available. Okay? And so we are going to use linear tax or non-linear tax, but in either case, it's distortionary. Distortionary in the sense the tax is going to distort how you make your economic decision, right? But then, so this distortion is going to go a long way throughout the process of this multiplier, right? So that's what we need to pay attention. Now we can look at other way to differentiate types of fiscal policy. Okay, and here, so we are going to differentiate fiscal policy by categorize them into automatic stabilizer versus discretionary fiscal policy. Okay. So what is automatic stabilizer? So those are government spending and taxation rules. Okay. It's going to be automatically respond depending on the state of the economy. I'll give you an example. so that we can understand what is automatic stabilizer. Okay, so unemployment insurance. Okay, but what is unemployment insurance? So this is a government program to offer insurance benefit to whoever lost their job and who is characterized as unemployed. Remember, so if you have been unemployed for a long time and you are not actively looking for a job, and then you are not in labor force, you're not considered as unemployment, right? So just keep that in mind. Okay, so this unemployment insurance is a automatic stabilizer in the sense, first, it's going to automatically apply, right? Because whenever you're unemployed, you can go to Social Security office to claim your unemployment insurance. And secondly, so this unemployment insurance scheme or the government program will adjust based on the state of the economy. So when the economy is in a contraction, okay, and then so there are more people lose their job, right? Unemployment rate will go up, and then so this unemployment insurance program will becomes larger, or in other words, automatically government must spend more. But by spending more on unemployment insurance program, okay, so that actually is going to help the economy by increasing aggregate expenditure. Why? Because those unemployed, so they still can do their consumption or expenditure because they receive this benefit from the government. All right. So in that sense, so even we are in a recession, so this unemployment insurance benefit kind of stabilize our economy, right? By providing some support to aggregate demand. On the other hand, if we are in an expansion, unemployment rate will drop, and then there are less people qualified for unemployment insurance. So in that sense, so this unemployment insurance program will put on some pressures. So put some pressures on the aggregate demand because there are less people qualified for unemployment insurance. Right. So in that sense, so this unemployment insurance is automatically adjust aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure, right? Without further action from the government. In contrast, so there are discretionary fiscal policy actions, right? So this arises from deliberate actions by policymakers. Example, Obama stimulus. So that is after the financial crisis. Or in President Trump's administration, so he had tax cut. Right? And right now in President Biden, so he has these CARES Acts. Right? And right now, so there's another stimulus. Right? So make sure so the economy can recover after this pandemic. Right? So those are deliberate actions by the president or by the administration, not written as rules, or this is more like a one-time. But unemployment insurance somehow is written in the law. Okay, it's just automatically applied whenever the economy fluctuates. Right. But however, I want to emphasize, so earlier I showed you a video. It's called 99er, right? So it is about unemployment insurance. But this video is about, so the government extend the unemployment insurance scheme. Okay. So in that sense, so the unemployment insurance itself, it is an automatic stabilizer. But then the extension of unemployment insurance benefit, so that is discretionary. Okay, so there's two parts. Right. Now let's look at this practice question. holding everything else constant, the multiplier effect for taxes or transfer, A, is the same as the multiplier effect for changes in autonomous aggregate spending. And the B is smaller. All right, so the multiplier for taxes or transfer is the same. So the answer is B. It's smaller than the multiplier effect for changes in autonomous aggregate spending. So here, so this autonomous aggregate spending, you can think about this similar, like we discussed earlier, like a G. Okay. So you immediately has an increase in aggregate spending. But if we are talking about changes in tax or transfer, and then the initial response will be smaller, right? Because you have change in disposable income, but you're not going to spend all of those change, right? Now, so we can look at the impact of this multiplier. Okay. What we have shown here is the worldwide economy in the time period from 2009 to 2013. So this is after the financial crisis. Most of advanced economy has trying to do their best to stimulate the economy. But given their regulation or given their state of the economy, they may not be able to do what they want to do, right? Like this graph shows. So on the horizontal line, so we have change in cyclically adjusted budget balance. Okay. So positive number meaning they have budget surplus. But what does that mean? If you have a budget surplus, means you must reduce the government spending, increase your tax, so that you have surplus, right? So if it goes to this direction, meaning so you have a deficit, meaning you increase G, you decrease T, decrease tax. Right? On the vertical line, you have percentage change in GDP. So now you can see there's a nice negative correlation, meaning so if you use this type of policy, your GDP is going to grow slower. On the other hand, you're going to grow faster. But now let's look at what are those two types of policies. Increase in G and decrease tax, this is called expansionary. Decrease G, increase tax, this is called contractionary. And then from here, essentially just says, so expansionary policy is going to help our economy, but the contractionary fiscal policy is going to depress the economy further, right? So this nicely shows there's a multiplier, right? So this is associated with fiscal policy. Now we move to the last part of this chapter. So we are looking at government budget, understand deficit, understand government debt. Okay. So the question we are going to ask, or we are going to answer in the rest of this chapter, is about how do surplus and deficit fit into the analysis of fiscal policy, or how we understand surplus and deficit. And secondly, we need to understand deficit good things and a surplus bad things. Is that always true? Okay. So to start, let's look at the national debt of the United States, because the debt is going to link with deficit closely, right? And if you click this link here, so you should see the real-time number, right? So this real-time number is much bigger. Oh, by the way, so this is total national debt, right? All right, to understand the relationship between surplus, deficit, debt, and how that fit into the fiscal policy, we start with a few equations. Okay. We start with saving of the government equal to tax, so this is income of the government, minus spending, minus transfer. Okay. All right. Now, if this equation gives you a positive number, meaning so you have more income than what are you going to spend. So in that case, the government is running a surplus, right? Or we can say, so you have a positive budget balance. Right-hand side is your budget balance, right? So you have income minus your spending. Okay, positive means you have a higher income than your spending. Okay, so this also means you have a surplus. On the other hand, so if your income is less than your spending, you have a negative budget balance. The government is running a deficit. Okay, so this is how we understand the number in this equation. Okay. Now let's see how this is going to fit into the discussion of fiscal policy. So if we are in a recession, and usually the government won't have expansionary fiscal policy, but this expansionary fiscal policy usually work as follows: decrease tax, increase G, increase transfer. So that's going to make the right-hand side go to more negative territory. So that means the discretionary expansionary fiscal policy will make our deficit larger. Right? On the other hand, so if we initiate some contraction fiscal policy, meaning so you're going to increase tax, decrease G, decrease transfer. Then what happened? Then you're going to see this number on the right-hand side becomes more positive, meaning so you may increase your surplus, right? So this is how fiscal policy can affect the government budget, right? Also, this is how they are going to interact with each other, right? Okay, so this is how the actual budget looks like for the United States. And here we plot the deficit. Okay, and it means so positive number, meaning so you have T here. So because this deficit, essentially this is a negative of your government budget. Or in other words, the number we show here is G plus transfer minus T. Okay, this is what we show on this diagram. We can see since 1960, pretty much in most of the year, so the US government is running a budget deficit. And also you should notice during recession, the government usually has expansionary fiscal policy, meaning reduce T, increase G, increase TR. This implies the deficit will increase, but this is actually what happened. Right? Okay, so from this history, so we understand the interaction between government budget balance and the fiscal response. Right? Okay. Now, so we can compare the budget deficit, as we just seen in previous slides, with unemployment rate. And you can see these two are tracking each other. Why they track each other? So for a couple of reasons. First, so remember when the budget deficit will increase. It increases when we are in a recession. And why it increases when we are in a recession is because the government won't use expansionary fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. But this expansionary fiscal policy will lead to larger deficit, right? Particularly in bad time of the economy. But then, so when the economy is in a bad time, usually the unemployment rate goes up. Okay? So this is the first reason why it just track each other. And secondly, remember, so we talk about the automatic stabilizer. Right? So when unemployment rate increase, and then the government automatically must spend more because there are more people lost their job, they will qualify for unemployment insurance benefit. And then the government spending must increase. Right? So there are those are at least two reasons why they track each other. And the third, so the budget deficit is equal to G plus TR minus tax. When unemployment rate increase, there are less people working, or the economy is producing less. And then income drops, then so the tax we can collect will decline. Right? So those are the three reasons why these two will track with each other. Okay. But then certainly from the discussion we had, okay, so we may want to calculate a slightly different budget deficit. Why is that? It's because the budget deficit or the raw number we saw from previous slides has the effect of business cycle, like the last point I mentioned. In the recession, so you're going to receive less tax revenue. In the boom, so you're going to receive more tax revenue, right? So due to the business cycle or due to the business cycle fluctuation. So to better reflect the health of the economy or to reflect the government policy, so we also calculate cyclically adjusted budget balance. Okay, so this is the estimate of budget balance, assuming if the economy were at a potential output. Right. So now here, this purple line is the actual budget deficit, and this brownish line is the cyclically adjusted. What is the difference? So you can see, so this brownish line or the cyclically adjusted fluctuates slightly less, right? So when we are in a recession, this cyclically adjusted is going to be smaller, the deficit is smaller, because we are trying to estimate what would be the budget balance look like if we add potential output. Now, if we add a potential output, meaning so we are going to collect more tax. We are going to spend less transfer, right? So this we calculate this just to understand or to reflect the fundamental health of our fiscal policy, right? Because those spike is temporary, right? But this is more like a trend. And why this is temporary is because the recession is so severe, and then so you're going to have unprecedented unemployment rate, high unemployment rate. So your tax drops and your transfer increase. I'm just talking about here. So now if we look at cyclically adjusted, so we better understand the burden for the government, right? And then the next question is, so the deficit, how the government is going to finance this deficit. The answer to that is by issuing bond. Right? Here is the example how the bond will look like, but depending on the situation. Right? So during World War I, so the government issued bond. So basically, the government borrowed from the public, so to finance the war they need to fight. Now, in peaceful time, like in modern time, like in 2009 or 2020, the government also need to issue bond so that they can fight the financial crisis or to fight the coronavirus. Right? Okay, so let's just take a brief break, and then so we continue our discussion.